In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some events that happened away from the battlefields during the Civil War. First of all, both the North and the South had to figure out how to pay for the war. Soldiers needed to be paid, equipment needed to be purchased, and so on. So both sides decided to create an income tax for that purpose. You can see the Union created a 3% income tax, and the Confederacy also passed an income tax. Additionally, both sides needed to figure out how to get people into the military. Now, initially, there were volunteers on both the North and the South that volunteered to serve in their armies. However, both sides would need to resort to a draft. This is required military service. If your name or number comes up, you were then required to serve. Now, the war started in April of 1861, and both sides had a number of volunteers at the beginning of the war, but the Union, by the time we reached March of 1863, needed people to join the Army, and as such resorted to the draft, which you can see here. All white males between ages 20 and 45 had to serve if they were called. However, note the next item here. If you could afford to pay $300, you were exempt from service. In other words, you were able to, assuming you had $300, to buy your way out of serving. We're going to see later in this lesson that is going to cause the Union some significant problems. The Confederacy, on the other hand, started their draft earlier in April of 1862, and white men were supposed to serve for 3 years if they were called up. I should say white men between the ages of 18 and 35. The fact that the Confederacy had to change this to age 50 indicates how their smaller population and battlefield deaths were going to impact them and require the age for draft to be raised. You would be mistaken if you thought that every Northerner was in favor of fighting the Civil War. This cartoon indicates that there were Northerners that were against Lincoln's policies and fighting the Civil War. These Northerners earned the nickname of Copperhead. A copperhead is a poisonous snake, and this is not a positive term that was applied to these people. You can see here in the cartoon, you have copperheads. I can just increase the size of this a little bit. The Northerners that were against the war are pictured as snakes, and the caption reads, "The Copperhead Party in favor of a vigorous prosecution of peace." Of course, these Copperheads wanted the war ceased immediately. We can also tell here that the cartoonist is against the Copperhead position by drawing or depicting the Union as a Roman goddess type figure, and depicting the Copperheads as snakes, a unattractive animal with what most people view as very negative qualities. Let's return now to the Union draft law. Remember, it said that if you had $300, you could purchase your way out of serving in the Union Army. Well, people living in New York City, poor people living in New York City, were quite upset with this when the draft came to New York City, and you can see that they took to the streets based on these notes and rioted against the draft. Two groups of people were targeted in the city by the rioters. African Americans were targeted because many of the rioters were poor Irish immigrants that had arrived in this country fairly recently, and they were upset at having to serve and fight for a cause that they had no part, that they took no part in to begin with. So they resented this, and as a result targeted African Americans in the city. The other groups that were targeted in the city were wealthy people because of the fact that they could purchase their way out of serving. Ultimately, President Lincoln is going to order military troops in, and the rioters are going to be thrown in jail. We'll talk about the habeas corpus issues in a moment. These drawings here indicate some of the rioting that was taking place at the time. And you can see they were burning buildings, they were burning government offices, and this is a map showing the lower portion of New York City, of Manhattan in particular, and you can see that the rioters had gone around various parts of Manhattan to do mob violence, essentially, and were put down by the military, which took a few days for the military to arrive and stop the rioting. Now, if I can turn your attention to that, what President Lincoln did was suspend the rioters' habeas corpus rights. In a nutshell, he had them rounded up and all thrown in jail. Now, under normal circumstances, we have constitutional protections, our habeas corpus rights, where we are charged with a crime and provided with a fair trial. It says here that suspending habeas corpus allowed him, President Lincoln, to jail anti-war protesters and close anti-war newspapers. This being done has allowed future presidents that came after Lincoln to, during times of war, also limit or suspend groups of individuals' constitutional protections. Do understand, though, that Lincoln was the first president to significantly restrict people's constitutional rights and dramatically expanded presidential powers in the process. Let's turn our attention to the economies of the North and the South during the Civil War. The Southern economy fared very poorly. The blockade around the southern ports was very effective in preventing both war materials from coming into the Confederacy, but also many other food items that were coming in from outside of the South as well. This led to major food shortages, leading to occasional food riots in certain southern cities. Additionally, inflation was very bad in the South, leading to extremely high prices, particularly in the latter years of the war. The Northern economy fared much, much better during the Civil War. There were many factories in the North, and those factories were humming along, producing goods ordered by the government for the war. Inflation was also a problem in the North, but it was not nearly as bad as it was in the South. And women worked in many of those factories. This is something we're going to hear as we move later in the course into World War I and World War II, where we're going to repeat that item with women stepping up and working in the factories. So then, to summarize, the Union and Confederacy created an income tax to finance the war and pay for the items that they needed. Both the Union and Confederacy instituted a draft, although at different times, to supply soldiers for their armies. Poor New Yorkers, mostly recent Irish immigrants, rioted against being drafted, which prompted President Lincoln to suspend their rights and have them thrown in jail. The Northern economy did well during the war. The Southern economy did very poorly during the Civil War. This wraps up the Civil War portion of the unit. Starting with the next lesson, we are going to move into the post-war Reconstruction period.